Okay, now we entered part 2 in this study on who were the first or the earliest Australians coming in, because it's not correlating out correctly. It ended at an odd point here, so we'll reiterate and keep going. The Ainu of northern Japan, although now much mixed with the northern Japanese, are said to be among the last survivors of a once large population of archaic whites in Asia. It would probably be better if we discuss this in terms of Caucasians, and then it would be more acceptable. And the Ainu are definitely seen as such and only recently actually accepted, whereas the Uyghurs aren't really accepted now, are they? But give me a minute. But there was a once great population of Ainu, and I've done a couple of videos about them. Robert Seppard's done one or two that are important too, and I think enough people have whipped that cat enough to put it out there for people to see. But that ancient archaic armor book that I've shown in 3 or 4 different videos that I've got, that's about Japanese and Oriental armor, if you will. The odd thing about their shogun and their armor of those people is that a lot of them are over 6 foot tall. In fact, one of them is over 6'2", and there's a comment on it that if you took an Oriental person or a male at that time, you couldn't have got him to be that tall if he was standing on a brick. Eminent ethnologists like Carlton Kuhn and John Baker had absolutely no hesitation in placing the ancestors of the Ainu in this branch of humanity. Sonia Cole said that the Ainu, who are clearly a branch of archaic Caucasian or white stock, which was once widespread in Asia, also probably in Europe. Of course, but recently Mongol, or it might be a separate population of Caucasians, unrelated haplotypes inside. Recent Mongoloid admixture is often seen. However, often the Ainu show a striking resemblance to Russian peasants, and it seems quite probable that the ancestral white stock or Caucasian stock once extended right across Asia into Russia. Modern genetic studies don't rule out the idea of archaic Caucasians having once been in Australia, or of some of their genes having trickled down to modern Kuris somehow through a trace. In Aboriginal affinities, looked at in world context of McIntosh and Larnock, and W. Howells reports on a modern study that measures the morphological proximity of Kuris to various other racial groups. Closest to the Kuris were the Aboriginal Tasmanian people. Next in closeness were the Tolai of the New Britain, or Birdswells Negritos. Then came, of all people, medieval Norwegians. The fourth closest group in terms of morphological similarity to modern Kuris was the Ainu. So, one apparent problem with Birdswell's theory has to be addressed. No contemporary ethnologist says that Kuris show any evidence of early genetic influence from Asiatics. So how could this happen actually? Well, there's a few different ways this could happen, where they could get genetic influence and then it would flop away. Let's just give a little separate scenario here, where you'll have somebody coming in and ruling some people and then breeding in with them and making males and females, and then they disappear for one reason or another and they're gone. But their male descendant line also gets killed off, but their genetics leave on into females. Therefore, even if they have a male, then the males that are not genetically related to that person will be impinging upon it, making that Y haplogroup back on the top of it, but it will still contain genetics from the other previous interaction, if you followed me. So how could archaic Caucasians have got through to Australia without bringing in at least a few stray Asian genes? Well, after all, human nature being what it is, when two races come into proximity, genes are usually exchanged somehow. The answer seems to be that at the time there were no Asians in the path of an archaic Caucasian or white migration to Australia from northern Asia. That whenever you look at it, in actuality, the Asiatics weren't controlling an area as big as they were today. In fact, Asia is from Caucasians. Yeah, just like Europe. In fact, Europa was a Phoenician princess and so on. Africa was also named by Caucasians, but that's because if you look at Herodotus' maps, it dies off pretty much at the sub-Saharan, and they didn't know it really existed. Unknown to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world was pretty much unknown to them too, yeah. So, an easier path into that situation is what he's talking about, into all the way into Australia and or admixed people. Imagine that they got some of the genes and perked up, but then rebred with each other and then still made it through that point. It could. The thing that we're still missing here in my critique to this whole situation is there's a point where you go from the phenotypes of the skulls that really, like we were looking at in 30,000 years ago, 14, and then all of a sudden 9 or 8, it's the people that are there, and they've been there for the last 10,000 years and are called the aboriginals, but are they really the exact aboriginals? Is there a change? And if that change is just, a mix from the islanders right next to them, you can kind of see that, but there's something else that's not evident that's involved, which is readily apparent. In 1988, Dr. Joe Kaminga and Professor Richard Wright of Sydney University did a computer analysis of the old man skull from Peking, about 9,000 to 11,000 years old, and found that it was not Asiatic. By that he means not oriental in shape, in circumference, and cranial form. There's a lot of that situation going on because they're really Asiatic, or Oriental is something that has been conflagrated in a modern day where we think of Asian food and you think Chinese food, and that's really not really Asia. The major portion of Asia still to this day has a European or a Caucasian contingent in it. The northern part has a contingent to it, but then of course you have to discern where we end Europe at as we're going across the top, don't we? It fitted somewhere between modern Caucasoids, Kuris, and Ainu. Therefore, wherever the modern Chinese originally came from, they are presumably immigrants to that region sometime in the last 10,000 years from an island people that were really pushed to the end of the earth, and a smaller population that has a few vibrations in it that we can see today from the different variations on a theme that are in those. But in reality, they got knocked down quite a bit to a very small population right at the Younger Dryas event, and that actual bottleneck seemed to happen across the planet in many ways, probably leading to the freak out that's here. But yet in every one of these outlander situations we're talking about, there seems to be an unknown hominid involved that allows them to end up with their phenotype and looks that they have, but also genetics that wouldn't be corresponding and connective the way that it should be if everybody came from one little flower garden and bloomed out across a field. If you follow me. In fact, there's a whole lot of different flowers going on here. In fact, if you get to the ends of the field, there are totally different types of flowers there. Ones you wouldn't classify necessarily as being the exact same kind of flower like we try to do in a modern day. Archaic Caucasians that the Chinese displaced in Asia were pushed to the fringes. Those holed up in Japan were gradually forced further north of the Ainu, giving way before superior numbers and quite likely in the face of newly introduced diseases, which definitely can happen. Some of those in northeastern Asia had probably already crossed into the Americas. Yeah, and that's how we can end up with far many different types of Indians, is that it really wasn't exactly one little group of people, and then that group of people spawned out like they were the family Robinson, and then they bred. No, it didn't work that way. Didn't work that way. Others may have ventured to, or at later date been pushed towards Southeast Asia and may have reached Australia. At this stage we can only await further archaeological evidence or anthropological evidence, but once you look at anthropology and the way that they look at things, they have to be under a tight knit. It's really archaeology and other forms that keep pushing the boundaries that they have to live up under whenever they give their net. Isn't it? It is essential that fresh discoveries from before the Curry period in Australia should be preserved for scientific testing and not wantonly destroyed, as were the pre-Curry remains from Cow Swamp, and as is currently proposed for the remains of 108 individuals from the Willandra Lakes region of the World Heritage Area of New South Wales. I kind of agree with that. If we're looking at the archaeological remains of so-and-so and everything, it has to be kept in some way that we know it's being kept real well, and everybody knows it's being kept real well. And I think it better goes one way. It really does. And there are ways of doing it the other way that could lead to that same thing, but then there would still have to be testing on each one, and then reinterring the bones, getting enough material for testing and further testing and so on, and it becomes somewhat of a mess that you have to go out with. And what, again, this is an example of is modern pandering, where we're turning around and making these people believe that they should act in this way about their remains different than anybody else's that anybody's looking at in archaeology. And it's kind of a touchy point here because we are talking about, human remains. If we were talking about an animal, no one would give a damn. If they really weren't related, you wouldn't have as much ability to talk about it. Here's all of his sightings that he goes through just on his 3-part article here that we've just gone over. Quite a bit. So leave your thoughts down below. I've kind of issued my thoughts as we've been going along here on the situation, but one thing can be seen for sure: the people that used to live in Australia are not the people that are living in Australia today, and something happened. We have no evidence of anything that happened, but we do have that. An interesting thing to add in here, when we keep talking about 50 and 60,000 years ago, is about 2 years ago now, I made a video about an iron knife, smaller daggers, iron knife, probably meteoric iron, found in Australia in a little cave overhang where they had some writings and so on, and the people there decided to do a little dig and see if they could find something. And what they found was the remnants of a knife that was still pretty well protected, but the stuff that was associated with it, right there directly with it, they had carbon dated, and it flopped at like 48, 49, 48, 49, 51, 49,000 years ago. A, it was a knife. B, it was iron. And of course, of the effect and all the nickel that's in it, it must have been to that exact point where it lasts a real long time, like meteor iron does. You might look that up in my at my channel. Just look up Australian iron weapon or something, or iron knife. I bet it pops hot. Anyhow, this just makes me want to do one more about a connective, and then one about islanders, and then all of a sudden how that connects to Orientals as we know of them. Peace.